Um, Thank you everyone for coming today. As you all know, we are just Vue Columbus Meetup, and today we have Divya from Netlify. She will be giving an overview about Vue 3 and Composition Function APIs. And with that said, I would like to give it over to Divya.
Cool. Let me share my screen. All right. It's good?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Divya Sasidaran. I go by short div on the interwebs if you're into social media and things like that. And I work at Netlify, as Bhaskar was saying. I wish I could ask how many of you use Netlify, but I can't see how many of you in the audience, but I'll assume everyone uses it. But just to let you know, Netlify is a platform that helps developers deploy their static applications, and we built a lot of tools and integrations to help that process. And you can find more about it at netlify.com, or you can ping me if you have questions about it at all. So today we're going to talk about the compositional API. This was it came out earlier this year. I want to say like June or July. And it caused a huge stir in the community. It was initially called like the function-based component API, and this was the original, or at least I think this was from a month ago or so. And specifically, this is the API that was, so 30th of May was when it started. And it was essentially a huge controversy, mainly because of this bit, which is the adoption strategy. There was a lot of fire online because people were starting to notice, and this is taken from the history of it. So this is not currently in the API, they changed it since. But specifically what happened is that they had two different builds. There was going to be a compatibility build, which would have the new stuff and like older 2.x stuff. And then the standard build, which would have the new APIs and only some 2.x. And so it signaled to the community that they were Vue 2 or Vue 3 was moving away from Vue 2 syntax. And I think that caused a lot of people to get really upset because we all love Vue, and a lot of the syntax that happened, that is the way it is the reason that we choose Vue. And so that was a huge thing that happened, specifically, as I said, this particular part. And then also there was a lot of like controversy online. So Evan tweeted about how he wanted to like change the way the framework was going, and people were wondering, like, honestly, this seemed like a joke. It might have been, I have no idea, I have no context on it. But it was, I think people were afraid that Vue was going to pull like an Angular 2 or a Python, where it would just move from one syntax to another and then kind of leave half the community behind. And so that was a bit concerning. And so like with that, a lot of people who actually hated on Vue or Evan didn't actually read the API. And so they didn't have full context on it. And so with this talk, we're going to dive into the API so you yourself can form opinions on what you think the API might be. And so what exactly is in Vue 3? So I want to start with a disclaimer, which is that the Vue 3 compositional API, specifically the one I'm talking about, is subject to change. So I've given this talk in, I want to say in July, and since July, that API has changed, I think twice, which is really annoying because I had to update these slides like quite a number of times. And so if you're following along specifically for this talk, there's a chance that all the code I show you will be irrelevant in a month. But that's just the way it goes. And so the way that the term of this particular thing was called Vue hooks, or that was what people online called it, but it's not actually called Vue hooks. It's maybe called Vue functions, but even then it's like maybe Vue compositional functions. And even then, like, we complain that the API is changing, but the naming is also changing because previously it was a functions API, now it's compositional API. So everything is kind of up in the air with Vue. But right now, as it stands, we'll go over the syntax. And so if you write a single file component, it looks very similar to this. This is just a hello world message. There's nothing more to it. And the difference between Vue 2 and Vue 3 syntax is this setup part. And that's where a lot of the magic of Vue 3's reactivity comes in. And so as you can tell, setup has two arguments. It has props and context. We'll dive into those two things as we move through this talk. But for now, we can just leave that for now. And so this, as I said, is like very similar to our hello world function with a little bit of a difference, which is that in our setup, we're returning our message data property. And then that is what we show in our template itself. And so one thing I want you to note is that the way setup works, whenever you return a data property, in this case, it's pretty static, it's only available in the render context. And this will make sense as we progress through the talk. So I'll add some reactivity because our hello world example is pretty static. So this is an example of like an input element. As you're typing, it updates like a text element, and that's all there is. And so very simply, it looks like an H2 element and an input element, and maybe you might put a V model to it. So in Vue 2 syntax, you would just return a data property called text, and then you can do the two-way binding with the V model. So really basic, really simple. You get reactivity out of the box without you having to do a lot of work. The difference with moving towards Vue 3 syntax is that I showed you earlier, you have this setup property where you return text. The problem is that when you return it, I kept talking about it being static, and it is, because when you return a data property through setup just as is, it's not reactive because we didn't make it reactive, so Vue doesn't know to update it, so the V model doesn't work. So how exactly do we make this reactive with the new syntax? So this is where refs come in. Ref is a new thing that Vue introduces, which makes an element reactive. And so in order to instantiate an element, instead of doing just text equals like an empty string, you have to do initiation and instantiation. So you pass in a null value. You can pass in an empty string if you so choose. That's fine too. And that makes text reactive. So when you return it, V model works, that two-way data binding works, because every time you type in, Vue knows that that element is updating and it can update itself internally. And so that's where the magic happens. It happens in ref. And so let's move on to like another example, which is a bit more complex. So the previous one was just an input that updates a text property. Let's move on to one where it's actually maybe a button that increments a counter. So there's in this particular case, there's an element that increases, and then there's a specific button that increases it as well. So here we have a couple of things. We have three elements. We have a data property, we have a computed, and we also have a method that updates those values. So really simple. We're used to these properties already from working with Vue 2. But when you work with Vue 3, it looks a bit different. So ref obviously seems similar to us. It's a way to instantiate a data property to make it reactive. And then computer is a little different. It looks a bit kooky. The idea is that you are updating the existing data property count. So you're essentially passing an anonymous function to computed, and then you're updating count.value, which is the count, the value of the count. So in order to grab the value from count, you have to do count.value, because count itself is kind of a wrapper around it. So the value, in order to grab it, you do count.value, and then you do a +1, which is a computer property. And then, of course, the method itself is just a single method which just increments that value by 1. Again, we're grabbing the value by doing count.value, and this is really specific to how you grab values when you use ref in Vue 3. And then another thing that's really important to note is to make sure you return those properties that you want to show in your template itself or in your Vue. Because if you don't return it, your Vue doesn't know what exactly you're referring to, so because all of those are internal to the setup function. And so in order for your markup to know exactly what to refer to, you have to return it. So here we're returning our count data property, our +1 computer property, as well as our method, which then allows us to do things like this. We can grab the count, we can grab the +1, and then we can grab the increment. That's about it. And so the next piece of it is adding, as we go through, we're going to add more complexity. So this is kind of the very famous example of use mouse. It's a common example because it's a perfect way of showing state updates, like in a very specific way. So as you're moving your mouse, you're grabbing the XY coordinate, and then when you move outside of the container, it no longer captures that. So it's, again, very specific event listener type behavior, which you'll probably use in applications that you're building and working on. So to do this with Vue 3, what we're doing is we're creating a reactive property. So this is new. I talked a little bit about refs. So refs are single values, whereas reactive is a value of like multiple elements within it. So you can think about it as a original Vue 2 data property when you return like a giant object with items within it. That's exactly how this works as well. You have a reactive, and then you pass in here it's X and Y. And then we have a method update that updates those values as well. So here is something else to note. Reactive, when you create an object, in order to grab the value within that object, you have to do mouse position or mouse pause.x. So that grabs the X value from mouse pause because it's a giant object and you're grabbing that one element from that object. And same for if you want to grab the Y property and update it with the event itself. So again, really simple. That's a bit of the difference between the two, between ref and reactive. And we'll look into that and I'll show you the difference side by side in a later slide. And again, the thing to return is we're returning the mouse position, which is the data property, kind of the whole reactive object, which has the X and Y values. And then we're also returning that method, which updates the X and Y coordinates of our mouse position. And so, like, again, I kind of like went over it really quickly, but you might notice that this particular function, useMouse, is self-contained. So it's a method. In the case of Vue 3 syntax, it's called a compositional function. The idea is that it encapsulates logic specific to changing and updating a specific data property. So if I wanted to use it, I could easily use it in a component. So in my single file component, I will just grab that logic encapsulation from my compositional function. So I'll import useMouse from wherever I saved it. I don't think there's any convention around how exactly code organization works at the moment. So I called it functions. It's pretty, randomly named. And then, of course, in my export, I'm grabbing that I'm using setup here. And then I'm also doing object deconstruction to grab the two elements from my useMouse. So anytime I run the function, I have access to those two things that I'm returning from useMouse, which is specifically the mouse position and the update method itself. And so now I have access to doing things like on-mounted, on-unmounted. Another thing you might notice is that the changes in the naming of our lifecycle hooks. So previously you would do like mounted and created, but now you have this on-mounted, on-unmounted, on-created. So it's a bit of a different way of naming things. And the main difference for that is so that you'll know the difference between things. I think it's just purely a naming convention. And so what we're doing here is that on mounted, what we want is we want to add an event listener for any mouse move and then update that specific mouse property. And then the same for on unmounted, because anytime you add an event listener, you also want to make sure to remove it, because otherwise you don't want any event listeners just like sitting around, because that could cause issues in an application. So on unmounted, when we're not using it, remove that specific event listener with the method that's attached to it. And then, of course, we can return that mouse position, which is really useful because then we can just show that X and Y value quite easily if we wanted to in our markup. The thing that's important to note is, I think it's a bit tricky, but there's something that's missing and a bit wrong with the code that we wrote, which is specifically the window event. So when you add a listener on the window, the issue is that you're capturing mouse move even outside of a container, because it's mouse move within the entire window, not within the entire container. And so for this, what we want to do is we want to grab the specific event listeners that are only happening within a container. So one way to do this regularly is you would use a ref maybe. So here, as you can see on line 2, I called there's a ref called container. So I'm gonna use that in this particular case and bind the event listener to that container, so I can make sure that the mouse move doesn't update outside of it. So in order to grab the ref, you would do it from that context. So setup gives you 2 arguments, props, which you should understand what props mean. It's just whatever is passed to that element. And then context, which has a bunch of things, including slots, refs is another one. And you might notice also that there's a lot of naming things that are quite similar. This case of refs is not the same as ref, which is a singular for a reactive element. It's incredibly confusing, but Here in this case, we're accessing the specific reference, which is the reference to the container element. And then from that, I can just do refs.container and then add the event listener and remove the event listener as needed. So really easily now everything is self-contained and I don't have to worry about event listeners just sitting outside. So now that we've gone over a couple of examples, let's kind of bring everything back and talk about the terminology. So I've been throwing around a lot of things, and now we can just actually try to understand what these things mean. So there's this idea of refs versus reactive. And refs is, of course, not $refs. I think that's the other way of referring to them. I don't exactly know what the official way of referring to refs that relate to a container element. I'm just going to say $refs because that's generally how you use it in Vue 2. So refs versus reactive. In what case would you use one versus the other? So in my use mouse example, I used reactive. So reactive allows you to store more than one data property within it. So here are X and a Y, my mouse position, because in that case, they're both kind of related to the same event and element. But I could easily, if I wanted to, put them as separate values. So here, my X and Y are separate values, which is ref. And then in the second style, as you see on the bottom, that's one single reactive value with X and Y. And so again, like this is mostly a stylistic thing. You can choose whichever to use, but again, there's some drawbacks and there's a couple of things to note as you're working through it. So one thing to note is the way that you update elements, or the way that you access your values. So if you use separate values, or if you use ref, you can only access your property through doing a dot value. So if you have X and it's a ref, you have to do X.value or Y.value in order to grab the value. But if you were to do it as a reactive with various data properties within it, because it's one object, you're going to just take the object and grab the specific key that you're accessing. So in mouse position, in the second example, you're doing mousepos.x and mousepos.y. So again, it's just an object and you're just keying through whichever to get the value associated that you want. So this is a side-by-side reference, so you can see it a little better. So here we have, again, the specific compositional function that we created called useMouse. So we have our reactive and our ref. So it looks a bit like this. The reactive takes in an X and Y. The refs, the X and Y are completely separate, so they don't have any context of each other. And then when you update it, all you're doing in the first example, because it's reactive and it's one giant object, you have to grab the key that you want for that specific value. So mousepos.x and mousepos.y. And in the second example for ref, you want to do X.value and Y.value to grab the values from those elements or variables that you want. And then you return them. And this is kind of the kicker of the difference between the two. So yes, it's different in terms of how you access the value, but it's also different in terms of how you return things, because it generally dictates whether it's reactive or not. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So in the first example, I returned mousepos as an object. And in the second example, I return X and Y separately. And this allows me to capture the reactivity. If I were to do something like this, which is mouse position, I'm grabbing that mouse position from useMouse. Oh, so I'm going to show you how to use this first before I explain like the specific issues with how you expose elements. So if I were to move forward to the consuming component, so that's kind of the kicker in terms of how you use those things. So in the consuming component, I can easily, just using object deconstruction, grab the specific elements I want. So whenever I use mouse in my, I think I flipped these, but anyway, so in my refs example, I'm just grabbing the X and Y specifically. And then in my reactive, I'm just grabbing the whole element itself. So in the reactive example, because mouse pos is one object, I'm just grabbing that. And then update, of course, is the same thing. There's not much difference there. And then I'm returning it, which again, this return is what makes it accessible in the markup. So if I wanted to show the X and Y position, when I return it from my setup like this, I can then use it, and it updates as needed. And so again, this is a consuming component. So this is coming back to like issues with refs and reactive and things and drawbacks and issues that you can come up against. So here I'm actually not doing it the way I did before. So in reactive, you would notice that I'm grabbing X and Y separately. So mouse pause is actually not being returned, or I'm not grabbing mouse pause, I'm grabbing X and Y. And then I'm trying to return X and Y, and that won't work at all because X and Y are not reactive. And by grabbing it just as is from the reactive element, I'm losing that reactivity out of the box, which is kind of annoying. Another kind of thing that tends to happen is that if I have a setup, and if I were to just return the mouse, so instead of, this line should be use mouse and I'm calling it. So there should be parentheses after the use mouse. So I'm calling it and I'm doing like an object deconstruction. That also will not work. And that's because, again, it has issues with reactivity and how two components. So the moment you do your own object deconstruction and you try to do various things and optimizations, because a lot of things are abstracted away, you lose the ability to do reactive stuff. So again, this is something that can happen when you're writing your applications, and I've done it many times as I'm working through this. So that's from a high level what everything works. So theoretically, it's great, like to kind of go through. If you read the RFC, you would obviously have known everything I mentioned. Nothing I talked about is new. But the thing that makes it concretized and for us to fully understand what we're working with, it's useful to actually have an API that we can use, because using it allows us to understand the implications and how exactly it changes the way we think about and write our applications. So if you've looked around the interwebs, you would see that there is a plugin called Vue Composition API, or a package, and that exposes not every, but some pieces of the Composition API that gives you the ability to play around with the existing RFC. Because that is a nice way for you to actually like play around with it, see how it works within your application, and maybe make comments and add to the RFC if you so choose. And so in order to work with this, all you would do is you would install it like you would any other package. You can use yarn, you can use npm, either would work. And then that's how it works. And so for the example moving forward, I'm going to show the code for updating a specific element. So here we have a map element. It's very simple. Essentially, I'm grabbing the GeoJSON from the Boston Marathon route. So it starts in Hopkinton and then it goes all the way to Boston. Essentially, I'm taking a segment and I'm updating a specific point as it's going through that marathon. So it's following a line and it's updating based on a specific time that I give it. And so this is showing reactivity, because usually when you put a point on a map, it's pretty static. And the way to make it dynamic is to update the specific point. And so you update the location. And so here I'm using Vue's reactivity system in Vue 3 to do this. And I'll jump into the code just so that you understand what I mean by that. So here, there's a lot of like boilerplate Mapbox stuff. If you don't understand it, don't worry about it. We're going to talk about specifically the reactivity element of it, but I'll just breeze over just so you know what's happening. So here we have our single file component, and I'm doing some things, which is one, I'm fetching some data. So here it's just like some GeoJSON that I'm fetching, and then I'm setting that data to route. So route is just a data property that I'll need later. So I want to save it somehow. So in create it, I'm just going to fetch, and then I'm going to set the route to some data that I fetched, which I can then use later. The next piece of the code is to instantiate the map. Again, this is boilerplate Mapbox stuff, so don't get too caught up in it. I'm instantiating a map, so I'm creating a map in my mounted. And then I'm also making sure the map is loaded. So this is something I'll need later because I want to make sure the map is loaded before I do anything else. So Mapbox gives you an onload handler. So onload, you can do a bunch of stuff. So here I'm adding a source. So adding source means that the map can then add data to itself. So you would add a source and then you would add a layer. So those two are ways in which you can add data to a map and then visualize it. So add source is to add data, add layer is to visualize the data that you added. And then this is where the animation piece comes in. So I mentioned that I was saving the loaded property. So whenever my map is loaded, I update the loaded to true. So initially, when the component is created, loaded is false because the map doesn't exist. But then the loaded becomes true when the map exists or when the map is created. And so I'm watching for this. And the main reason is because I want to make sure that I update the point only when the map has been created, because what's the point in having a point when there's no map? So here's my watcher. And then I'm creating a method called animate marker. And then within that, I'm doing a bunch of like animation, request animation stuff. Again, not to get too bogged down by the details, but what's happening here is that I'm grabbing the current timestamp, and then I'm also making sure that there's a specific duration. So here it's like, 60 seconds or 6 seconds, I think it is. And then I'm also making there be a speed. So 5,000 is 5,000 meters. So the line is hard-coded a little. And so 5,000 meters over the duration, which is like 6 seconds. So the point is gonna travel 5,000 meters for 6 seconds. That's pretty much all this logic is doing. And then the timestamp that you see on line 31 is just to note the starting time. And then line 35 is just time that gets updated as the function gets called. So this will become important as we go through the code in a bit. So the thing about updating a marker is that we need to know where exactly that marker is along a point. So I'm using turf, which is a package for doing any kind of calculations, geographic calculations. So what I'm doing is I'm grabbing all of the coordinates and I'm trying to find the lines. The path is just like where exactly the point is on the path. So that will be useful in terms of figuring out where exactly the line has traveled and how much longer it has to travel. And then time elapsed is just finding out the start time and the current time. Well, the current time and the start time. So you're trying to find the difference between the two to see how much time has elapsed. And that's useful because as we're going through, we have this if conditional, and all it's doing is it's checking whether or not you've passed 5,000 meters. So again, a little hard-coded, but that's not the point of this. The point of this is to show reactivity. And so all I'm doing is just making sure that the point on the map or the marker has not moved past that 5,000 meters that I told it to move down. And so the if conditional does that check. And if it does pass that 5,000 meter mark, I'll cancel any animation frame. So essentially it stops this from running. If it doesn't, all it's doing is it's finding how much distance has been traveled. So time multiplied by speed. This is like very elementary school mathematics here. And then I'm using turf again, which is a package, and I'm grabbing my path. So path is like 5,000 meters and then distance traveled. So it tells me exactly where the marker is on that path. So it's really useful as a way of figuring out how to place my marker, because I don't want it to be not on that path. I want it to specifically be on that path. So that's essentially what that's doing. And then I'm going to grab, so this again is very Mapbox specific, but what is happening is I'm grabbing the point source layer because the source layer has the data that I want, and then I'm setting it with the new data. So this allows me to update data as I'm running through this function. So I can update the data on the source layer, and then automatically Mapbox updates the feature property as well. So the marker moves without me having to do extra work. And then the other thing that I mentioned is just the request animation frame. This is again like some animation things that you need to do in order for everything to work as needed. So I'm just going to wave my hands here, and this works. I can guarantee it. I have example code if you really want to dig into it. But again, everything I showed you is hard coded. So it's one single file component with the map logic as well as the reactive update marker logic, which is fine if you want only one component. But when is that the case? We often, whenever we create some logic, we want it to be encapsulated because there's a chance that we're going to use that again. And I'll show you an example in which that is the case. So here is an example of two markers that are updated kind of simultaneously, but they both have different timings. So the nice thing with this is that when we use that logic and we encapsulate it, we can do multiple markers on a map. So if you wanted to show runners and see exactly the path that they would take or how they compete with each other, that's one way to do it. So that's really important as a way to make sure that we can encapsulate that logic. So in order to do that, we're going to create, harness the power of compositional functions. So we're going to do something called use Waypoint. I'll show how exactly to use it first before I go into how to extrapolate that logic. So here is our same single file component, and we're importing our compositional function. Assume it exists. It's called use Waypoint. And so we're going to use our setup function, which is just, again, a Vue 3 thing. And so we're going to grab the some properties from the, that should be composition, by the way, not function. That's my bad. So you have a watcher, you need a ref, you need an on-mounted and on-created. So doing that from the Composition API. And then you're also making sure that you are creating some variables. So as you can tell on line 13, I'm going to create a map instance, which gives me the instance of the map, which is, again, reactive. And then I also want to create this line string property. And I want that line string property to be reactive as well. And then on creator is where the magic starts to happen. So on creator is where I'm fetching my data, and then I'm setting my data. So line string initially was null. And then line string now is the GeoJSON. So it's the entire line string, or like the 5 meter or the 5,000 meter. Actually, yeah, that specific path is that value. So it's a line string element. So it has a couple of coordinates within it. And then on mounted is where we start to add the map. So we instantiate the map, and then on load, we set the map. This will become evident why it's important in a second. We set the instance to the map. And then we also do an add source and add layer. So again, there's nothing much difference here. All we're doing is the same thing we did from before with a couple of tweaks here and there. And so the other piece is how we're using that compositional function. So I showed you a couple of the setup logic of using the compositional function with setup, with the specific lifecycle hooks and so on. But this is kind of where the crux of that reactivity piece works. So what I'm doing is I'm grabbing a move point. So move point is a method. It's a method that will update our point along the path or along the path on the map. And so I'm grabbing that specific method. And of course, use Waypoint is being called, and I'm passing it data. And that's important because it needs to have access to data that it can then run, which is essentially just route logic. It's just the route data. And then the watcher is also making sure that it's watching that line string. So line string starts as null. And that's because we didn't fetch anything yet. So once we fetch the data and set it, this watcher gets kicked off because it's like, oh, we have data now. Now we can run the marker and update it. So that's what this watcher is doing, is just checking to see that linestring.value has changed. And if it does, it's running that method. And specifically here, we have to pass in the map instance. So this is kind of kooky, but because the way that we worked it, we extrapolated our map logic from our logic of updating our marker. In order to update the marker, you need access to the map instance. So in order for that to work, we're going to pass in the map instance to our move point method. So that's essentially how to use it in the composing function. And so now with that kind of understood, sort of, we can move into how exactly our use Waypoint compositional function works. And so how that works is, again, we're going to start by creating a data property that's reactive. So we'll call it ref, because in this case, all it is, it's a single feature point. So this is some GeoJSON boilerplate in the way that GeoJSON works. It needs to be in a specific format. So we're going to create a single element called waypoint val, and that will be the reactive thing that gets updated. So the next thing is waypoint state. So this is where we get the request animation frame instance as well as our timestamp. And the timestamp is what gets updated as the timer moves on, or as the function gets called that gets updated. So it's nice to like have access to that. So then this is again exactly the same with a couple of differences in terms of how you're accessing things. So the time elapsed, it's again the current time, how much time has passed essentially. So it's the time minus the waypoint state dot timestamp. So again, that's like grabbing the timestamp from before. So like whenever the function was run last, grabbing that timestamp and then doing some mathematics on it. So that's like when you have a reactive property, that's how you grab it. You grab the key of that specific object, which is waypoint state. And then again, this is the part where you update it. So you want to get the map source, which is point, because that's what we call it. And then you're setting the data using that value. So you do waypoint val.value because we use the ref, not a reactive. And so because of that, that's the way we do it. So that's essentially what it is. And then we can return the move point, which is a method, which we are calling from our main thing. So what's happening is that whenever that method gets called, it's essentially just running through the entire function. So automatically everything works. The way that things work is fine. The only issue is that we currently have some dependencies between the two components. So when you have logic encapsulation, ideally, it should not have any reliance on any other component. Unfortunately, it is relying on the map instance. And in a sense, we don't want the update marker to have any sense of the map. It just needs to know where exactly positionally the marker needs to be. But it doesn't actually need to have the logic or any functionality for putting that marker on the map. We can leave that to the component. So let's change this a little bit. So all use waypoint will do is calculate where exactly the marker should be on the path and then send that data back to whichever component is requesting it. So we'll refactor it slightly. We'll create, this is our move point method. And again, this is the logic in which we grab that value. So waypoint.value equals like what this line 32 is doing is it's just calculating where exactly the marker is on a path. And then it's updating that property. And then we can just return that property from the function. So what's happening here is instead of exposing the method move point, we're calling that method. So anytime use waypoint is being called, the method move point runs automatically, and then waypoint value is just sent out. Every time it's updated, it just sends it out. And then whatever is subscribing to it will get that value out of the box. So the way to do it then is that we can just grab it, we can create a watcher maybe, and then with that watcher, we can just update that property and move it along as needed. So pretty straightforward, but it's kind of like a more complex way of working with Vue 2's or Vue 3 syntax for reactivity. So again, like the code that I showed you works today, but there's no chance that it'll work in a month or even tomorrow, really. So I want you to just take that with a grain of salt, although the concepts carry over. So I read the Vue Compositional Function API when it came out, and even though the syntax has been updated, the concepts carry over. So there is a benefit to keeping up to date, but at the same time, if you don't, you still understand. It's very easy to pick up, so don't feel like worried or anything. Because will stuff change in Vue 3? Yes, it will. It will obviously change, because I think Vue 3 is slated for release at the end of this year, but there has been no information from the core team on the exact date or if that is still the case. But keep up to date on that. And if you're interested in all the code that I showed you, here are some links. The first link is just like a playground, very simply to show you the counter, the use mouse example, and like a single file component for the map. The second example shows you the map component, but a bit more complex and fleshed out. So if you're really interested in that, take a look. If you're also interested in how Vue 3 has changed, you can feel free to check the commit logs, because I've had to update this specific example so many times. So it's actually really interesting to see the change of Vue 3 from the commit logs itself. I've just used that as a personal reference to myself. And so again, the links are up there. Feel free to look at the Composition API RFC. It's on Netlify. It actually makes it way easier to read as well, because like previously reading a GitHub issue and like trying to figure out where it is in the PR is really confusing. So I highly recommend just going onto that website. It shows you also the drawbacks of certain things, how it works really well with type inference, and it gives you a lot more context to the reasoning behind the changes in the syntax as well. So with that, thank you so much for your attention. And I guess I'll take questions. Is there any question? I don't know if I've been like talking to myself.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no worries.
We have a question here.
Okay.
So how will this new state management type reactivity affect things like VueJs and other extensions to the core Vue library?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think from the conversation that the Vue core team has had, they believe that you would still use Vuex as you would, because Vuex isn't actually going to change drastically. So you could use the difference with the Vue 3 compositional function, and the main reason for it is grabbing that reactivity element away from your Vue logic. So instead of it having to be like a single file component and your reactivity being in it, you can grab the logic out. So I have this theory that isn't actually official, which is that with this API, you can kind of mimic how Vuex works without using Vuex, because of the fact that the reactivity is exposed to you, and Vuex is using Vue's reactivity system like under the hood. That's how Vuex works. And so because the logic or the reactivity system is being exposed in this API, I believe that you could make your own Vuex or create your own system without having the dependency on Vuex. That's just but this is my theory. It's not official. No one has ever said anything like this, so don't take my word for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Still there?
Yeah.
So thanks for the presentation. I had a question on the naming convention. Why did they choose to the props in the setups and the setup function? Is that referring to the props property on the Vue component?
Yeah, it is.
Always?
Yeah,
so it doesn't have access to data or any of the methods on the component.
Correct. Yeah, correct. So props is just like whichever prop, like it's essentially how props works today. I believe context is where like they kind of bunch everything together. I don't believe you can access data from setup because I've tried doing that. So like if you have, let's say Vue 2 and you have data and then you have your setup, your data from the way that I've worked with it, I couldn't access it. So I believe that that's intentional, but I cannot be sure that that's the case. Like, I don't know if that's intentional per se, but from my understanding, you cannot access data because context has slots, context has refs. It also has a couple of other things that you might need that I can't.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about the one example you had, ref? Yeah. I don't know what you call it. Do you call that a composition, a reactive object maker constructor?
Yeah.
So the ref versus reactive constructor.
Yeah.
Is it traditionally used ref with a native type other than objects, and then reactive would just be used for objects?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it's essentially, I think the way the RFC wrote it was that it depends on how you want to store data. So if you prefer to have data as a native element, so like as just an exposed like single layer, then you would use ref. But if you wanted it to be like in the context of mouse position X and Y, that's kind of related. And so you would put that in an object using reactive. But honestly, you could use either, and the reactivity system works. Like it works in both cases. So I don't think there's a difference. The only difference is how you access those values. So if you use refs, you would use dot value. And if you use reactive, you would just do like whatever you call the object dot the key of the thing you're trying to access. Yeah.
That's weird. Last question is, what does the migration look like if you're trying to convert all your Vue 2 components to Vue 3? Seems like a lot of refactoring.
Yeah. So there's when this API came out, they were talking about moving away from Vue 2 completely, but after a lot of backlash from people in the community and people who weren't in the community, basically people on Hacker News, they decided that Vue 2 will continue to be supported in Vue 3 and in Vue 4, which I think is like a huge promise. But you don't necessarily have to update. The thing is, you don't have to update all of your components. So you can choose to access Vue 3's compositional syntax, but also keep a lot of the Vue 2 logic in your apps. So in terms of the way that you would migrate, it's not a lot, because you can choose to migrate it bit by bit, which I believe is just like an easier way of doing it. So it's a matter of like, this changes the way you think about your components. So it's a huge change, but in and of itself, like, let's say you have older components that have like legacy components or legacy code. You don't have to update those, but if you were to create new components, you can use the Vue Compositional Function API in Vue 3. And then like slowly move stuff over. You don't have to do it all at once. They'll work both side by side. Yeah.
Okay. That's it for me.
Cool.
Questions?
You guys?
Sorry, I literally have so many questions for you. I could be out here.
Cool. Shoot.
So for me, I just purely opinion here. I feel like part of Vue's charm is lost a little bit with this new syntax. That Vue was so appealing to me and to my team because it was so simple and so easy to pick up. I didn't need a Vue developer. I could grab a JavaScript developer, throw them in front of a Vue component, and they could pick it up in like 5 seconds. And I feel like this adds so much complexity on top of it that I feel like I lose a lot of the appeal that I originally got from VueJs. Where I feel like I could get the same reactivity, by extracting out my logic into utilities or services and calling them centrally through my components and things like that. So I guess what would be the appeal for someone like me who looks at that and is like, oh, this is not better. This looks way more complex. What would be the selling point for me on that?
So I think the way that they're selling this API at the moment is more as an advanced feature. So like, let's say similar to like how you use Vue Router. So not everyone use navigation guards in Vue Router, right? Like in order to use Vue Router, you would just like, you can add a router file, you can create routes and everything. You never have to use navigation guards unless you really need to. And it's considered an advanced feature. And that's when you kind of level up in terms of, not to say that if you don't use navigation guards, you're not like an advanced Vue developer. You can easily do a lot of things without it. And I think it's the same for this as well. So there's a lot of the reasoning behind writing things in the new compositional API is purely an architectural decision. So for some teams, they like to have the logic abstracted away. So let's say in the example I showed you, to update the marker is like a lot. It's a lot. And if I had that logic in my component, in my Vue component, it's really messy because it has like request animation frame and it has all these extra stuff and I don't know what's happening. But similar to what you said, if you put things in like a utility, you can think of a compositional function as a utility function. Then I have full access to like making sure I can check my markup and doing whatever I want with it without having the complexity of the logic that's updating it. That is purely architectural, because the idea is that oftentimes when you have a single file component, I think they have like a color map on the compositional function API that shows you like how code is organized without the compositional API and how code is organized with. And it shows just like the overhead of having to kind of jump through your functions or jump through your single file component, because you're like, oh, this thing is being updated and the watcher is here and the computer is here and the method is here. And like you're jumping constantly from one thing to another. So you're trying to use various properties that Vue gives you, but it also, there's a likelihood that it gives you a lot of cognitive load of having to like try to remember where everything is. And so with the compositional API, it kind of is like, this is where the reactivity happens specifically. And so it's boxed away. And so that way it creates a bit more, it's easier to parse. Yes, from a new, I do want to say that you're correct. From someone who is not a JavaScript developer or not a Vue developer, like that's a huge overhead. Like having the compositional API and being like, I don't know what this is, because it is like a super advanced feature. And it's something that like, honestly, you can be like an advanced Vue user and still not understand it, which is totally understandable. It's similar to like scope slots where people like nobody understands it. And so I think that's similar to this as well. And the nice thing is with the way that they're doing the adoption strategy I was mentioning is that you don't have to use it if you don't want to, because all this is doing is giving you reactivity without having your markup. So it's like, it's kind of abstracting those two things away. But if you don't care about that, you can still use Vue 2 and like have without having, you know, like the complexity of learning a new API and all these things. And I believe that with the, like, there's some upsides to using the compositional API. Again, it's like in the RFC where they talk about type inference, because like they can easily do type checking because of the way that they wrote that compositional API. So they know automatically how exactly your elements change. That would have effects on how the error messaging works as well. So there's like some tweaks and like nice things that come about from using it. But again, like in terms of what you were mentioning with the reactivity, you still get everything. Like if you use Vue, like current Vue 2 or Vue 3. Yeah.
Not really a question, but a comment. Yeah. So I watched the talk that Evan you did at Laracon recently, and I didn't remember it even today. I just now remembered it when you were talking. But the biggest performance feature of using the new API is actually so that the render function doesn't have to render the entire component every single time one property changes on the component. And in Vue 2, if you have like, you know, 400 lines of HTML with a bunch of data props being two-way binded inside the template, and one thing changes, it has to re-render the entire component in Vue 2. But in Vue 3, with those reactive and ref constructors, I'm assuming that that's how it's being able to encapsulate that specific piece in the template to be able to only update a little tiny piece of HTML versus the whole thing.
That's correct. I think there's also like a way in which the reactivity, also there's specific things that change with how sorry, go ahead. No worries. I think there's also some ways in which like the watchers and the computer are run. So I think they're run slightly differently in the composition API way of doing things versus on the Vue 2 way of doing things. So like, I think it's the way that it's built within the composition API, like tries to optimize for the watcher not running more times than it needs to run.
Yeah, because it runs like twice on component mount.
Exactly, because on mount it like runs, and then I think with the composition API it doesn't run until actually the property actually changes.
Cool. That's all I got.
I have one last one. How is testing with these new components? With this?
Yeah, so I imagine testing. So in the past, when you test like Vue components, because your logic is tied to your markup, the testing requires you to use like jest and shallow render because the two things are kind of related. But if you use the compositional API, because it kind of abstracts the logic away, you can actually test it, like I would argue, way easily because the compositional function doesn't really have to do with the markup at all. Like if anything, it's just the function that updates the markup. And so if you wanted to just test that the function is working, you could easily do that. You just pass in values and then check the output. So input output type thing. So you don't have to do a lot of like shallow rendering, which you would do in a regular Vue SFC type file component. But with this, you can just test with like, I don't know, Mocha or Chai or whatever you want to do without having to do any rendering stuff. Is that good? I think you're muted.
Okay. Yeah. Hi,
Yeah.
Hi, Divya.
Yeah.
So thanks for sharing us
Yeah.
the details about Vue 3 and the composition function APIs.
Yeah.
And thank you for speaking to our group. Sorry for the initial hiccups.
Oh, no, it's okay. It's fine. I'm glad it worked out.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for speaking, and we look forward to have you speak with us in our future events.
Yeah, sounds good. So I'll send you the slides so that you can like share it. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, have a good evening.
Good.